Hi guys. So today I'm going to be reading again The Secret of the Old Clock for Nancy Drew. And last time we were on chapter 12, A Desperate Situation. So I'm just going to read a little bit to catch up. The last bit from that chapter. When Nancy could no longer hear the tramp of his heavy boots, she was sure Sid had left the house. For a moment a feeling of great relief engulfed her. But the next instant Nancy's heart gave a leap. As she heard the muffled roar of the van starting up in the distance, a horrifying realization gripped her. "They've left me here to starve," she thought frantically. So now we're on chapter 13, The Frustrating Wait. At first Nancy was too frightened to think logically. She beat upon the door with her fists, but the heavy oak panels would not give way. "Help! Help!" she screamed. At last, exhausted by her efforts to force the door open, she sank down onto the floor. The house was as silent as a tomb. Bad as her predicament was, Nancy felt thankful that enough air seeped into the closet to permit normal breathing. Although she had little hope that there was any one within miles of the cottage, Nancy got to her feet, raised her voice, and again started shouting for help. Her cries echoed back through the empty house and seemed to mock her. "Oh, why didn't I have enough sense to tell Helen where I was going?" she berated herself miserably. "The girls at camp will never dream that I came here." Then Nancy remembered mournfully that her father thought she intended to remain at Camp Avondale for a week. He would not become alarmed over her absence until it was too late. "Someone may find my car at the side of the road," Nancy reasoned, "but it isn't very likely. Few persons pass this way so early into the season." She wondered, with a shudder, what had become of Jeff Tucker. The thief called Sid had hinted that the caretaker had received the same treatment as Nancy. If he was locked up somewhere, she could expect no aid from him. "Those thieves will get so far away that even if I could get out of here, I'd be too late." As the full significance of the situation dawned upon Nancy, panic again took possession of her. In a desperate attempt to break down the door, she threw her weight against it again and again. She pounded on the panels until her fingers were bruised and bleeding. At last she sank down again on the floor to rest, and tried to force herself to reason calmly. "I'm only wasting my strength this way. I must try to think logically." Nancy recalled that it was sometimes possible to pick a lock with a wire. She removed a bobby pin from her hair, opened it, and began to work at the lock. But in the darkness she could not see and made no progress. After 15 minutes she gave up the task in disgust. "Oh, it's no use," she decided dejectedly. I guess I'm in here for good." She began to think of her father, of Hannah Gruen, of Helen Corning, and other dear friends. Would she ever see them again? As despondency claimed Nancy, she was dangerously near tears. "This will never do," she reprimanded herself sternly. "I must keep my head and try to think of some way to escape." The trapped girl began to rummage in the closet, hoping that by some lucky chance she might find a tool which would help her force the lock of the door. Nancy searched carefully through the pockets of every garment which hung from the hooks. She groped over every inch of the floor. She found nothing useful, however, and the cloud of dust which she had stirred up made breathing much more difficult than before. The closet had become uncomfortably warm by this time. Longingly she thought of the fresh air and the cool lake water from which she was closed off. Then, unexpectedly, Nancy's hand struck something hard. Quickly investigating with her fingers, she discovered a wooden rod suspended high overhead. It was fastened to either side wall and ran the length of the closet. Evidently it had once been used for dress and coat hangers. "I might be able to use that rod to break out a panel of the door," Nancy thought hopefully. "It feels strong, and it's about the right size." She tugged at the rod with all her might. When it did not budge, she swung herself back and forth on it. At last, amid the cracking of plaster, one side gave way. Another hard jerk brought the rod down. To Nancy's bitter disappointment, she found that unfortunately the rod was too long to use as a ram in the cramped space. But after further examination, she discovered that it had pointed ends. I might use this rod as a wedge in the crack, she thought hopefully. The young sleuth inserted one end into space between the hinges and the door and threw all of her weight against the rod. At first the door did not move in the slightest. That old Greek scientist, Archimedes, he didn't know what he was talking about when he said the world could be moved with a lever, Nancy murmured. I'd like to see him move this door. As she applied steady pressure to the rod a second time, she saw that the hinges were beginning to give. Encouraged, Nancy again pushed full force on the lever. Oh, it's coming! She cried. Once more she threw her weight against the rod. A hinge tore from the casing, and the door sagged. It was now easy to insert the wedge, and Nancy joyously realized that success would soon be hers. With renewed strength, she continued her efforts. Then, just as another hinge gave way, she was startled to hear footsteps. Someone came running into the study, and a heavy body hurled itself against the door of the closet. For a moment Nancy was stunned. Could this be one of the thieves who had heard the noise she had made and returned to make sure that she did not escape? She discarded the theory quickly. Surely the three men would want to get far away as quickly as possible. But who was this newcomer? One of the Tophams? So one of you ornery robbers got yourself locked up, did you? Came an indignant male voice. That'll teach you to try putting on over old Jeff Tucker. You won't be doing any more pilfering. I got you surrounded. The caretaker! Nancy heaved a sigh of fervent relief. Let me out, she pleaded. I'm not one of the thieves. If you'll only let me out of here, I'll explain everything. There was silence for a moment. Then the voice on the other side of the door said dubiously, Say, you aiming to throw me off? Imitating a lady's voice? Well, it won't do you any good. No, sir, old Jeff Tucker's not getting fooled again. Nancy decided to convince the man beyond doubt. She gave a long, loud, feminine scream. Ah! All right, ma'am. I believe you. No man could make that racket. This way out, lady. Expectantly, Nancy waited, but the door did not open. Then she heard to her dismay. If that ain't the limit, the key's gone, and I've left my ring of extra keys somewhere. Not in my pockets. Nancy groaned. Oh, Mr. Tucker, you must find it. Have you looked in every one of your pockets? Please hurry and get me out. Hold on, ma'am, the caretaker said soothingly. I'll just check again. Nancy was beginning to think that she would still have to break down the door when she heard Jeff Tucker exclaim, Found it! You were right, ma'am. Key was in my back pocket all the time. Please, open the door, Nancy broke in desperately. A key turned in the lock, and the bolt clicked. Joyfully, Nancy pushed the door open and stepped out. For a moment, the bright sunlight in the room almost blinded her. When her vision adjusted, she saw a very tall, thin, elderly man in a blue shirt and overalls. He stared at her with concern and amazement. Mr. Tucker, she explained quickly, I'm Nancy Drew. I was here looking for you when these awful thieves came and locked me in the closet. She paused and gazed at the caretaker. I'm glad to see that you're all right. Their leader told me they locked you up too. She then asked the elderly man to tell his story. Jeff Tucker seemed embarrassed as he began to speak. I was plain hornswoggled by those critters, Miss Drew. They pulled up here in a moving van and told me I'd better go after some trespassers they'd seen nearby. So, the old elderly man went on with a sigh, I believed him. One of the men went with me down to the lake and locked me in a shed. I just got out. He shook his head sadly. And all this time they were robbing the place? Guess I'll be fired. Secretly, Nancy was inclined to agree, knowing the Tophams. But aloud she said reassuringly, Don't worry, Mr. Tucker. We'll report this robbery to the state police immediately. Perhaps the troopers can catch the thieves before they get rid of the stolen furniture. The caretaker looked somewhat relieved. And I can sure give a good description of those crooks. I'll never forget their ugly faces. Fine, said Nancy. A sudden thought struck her. Oh, before we go, Mr. Tucker, tell me, was there an old clock in this house? A tall, square-faced mantel clock? Jeff Tucker's bright blue eyes squinted. Mantel clock? Why, sure enough. He pointed to the mantel over the living room fireplace. Sat right up there. Got so used to seeing it, I couldn't remember for a minute. Don't know how come they took that too. Never thought it was worth much. The Tophams never bothered winding the thing." Nancy's pulse quickened. Knowing that the clock had been stolen, she was more eager than ever to have the thieves apprehended. She urged Jeff Tucker to hurry out to her car. "Where's the nearest state police headquarters?" she asked as they climbed into the convertible. "There's none till we get to Melbourne, Miss Drew." "Well, hurry then." Nancy headed as fast as possible for the highway. Would she succeed in heading off the thieves and recovering the old Crowley clock so she could learn its secret? And now we're at chapter 14, A Tense Chase. "Which way is Melbourne?" Nancy asked the caretaker when they reached the highway. "Down there," he pointed. "That's the direction the thieves took," Nancy told him, noting the dust and the tire marks which revealed the van's exit onto the highway. "But," she added, glancing at the dashboard clock, "they're probably too far away by this time for us to catch them." "Yes, ding it," Jeff muttered. Nancy drove as rapidly as the law permitted toward Melbourne. All the while, Jeff Tucker peered from one side of the road to the other. "Those rascal thieves might have just had nerve enough to stop and count their loot," he said to Nancy, "so I'm keeping a sharp eye peeled." Nancy smiled in spite of the gravity of the situation. "Maybe," she replied, "though I doubt that these men would be so reckless." There's a picture here, and it says underneath, "Nancy reported what had taken place at the Tophams' cottage." "Oh, I didn't mean out in plain sight. They might have pulled off the road back some of these closed-up summer places. We'll watch for their tire marks on any dirt-side road," the young sleuth said. Jeff became so absorbed in looking for the van's tire marks that he never asked Nancy Drew why she had come to see him at the Topham house. "Those fake movers," he said, as they neared the outskirts of Melbourne. "I wonder how far they went." Nancy did not reply until they came to a crossroad, and then she pointed. "They turned north here, on this dirt road. How much farther is it to Melbourne?" "Only a mile." As they came into the little town, Nancy asked her companion, "Which way to the state police headquarters?" "Go right down Central Avenue to Maple Street. Turn left and there it is." Reaching headquarters, Nancy parked the car and hopped out. Jeff Tucker followed as she walked briskly into the office. "I want to report a robbery," she told the desk sergeant after identifying herself. For a moment the officer, taken aback, looked in astonishment at Nancy. "You've been robbed?" he asked. "In our town?" "No, no," Nancy cried out. She then gave a quick but complete resume of what had taken place at the Tophams' cottage. Jeff Tucker added his account. The police officer needed no further urging. Immediately he summoned 4 men and issued orders. "Now," he said, turning to Nancy, "have you any idea which road the thieves took?" "Yes, officer. When we passed the road crossing a mile outside of town, I saw their truck tracks on the dirt road leading north. I'll be glad to show you." "Good. Lead the way. But first I'll send out a general alarm." "Hurry!" Nancy begged as she started out. "Those thieves have at least an hour's head start." Jeff Tucker had been advised to return to his home. Accordingly, he telephoned his son to come and pick him up in his car. "Good luck," he called out as the others pulled away. I sure don't know how I'm going to break this to the Tophams." Nancy was sorry for him, but she felt a thrill of excitement as she proceeded up the street, the police car following close behind. Beyond the town, Nancy chose the road which she felt certain the thieves had used. The 2 cars sped along until Nancy unexpectedly came to a fork. Both branches were paved and no tire marks were visible. Nancy stopped. The police car pulled up alongside. "What's the matter?" asked the officer in charge, whose name was Elton. "I'm not sure which way to go now." The policemen sprang from their automobile and began to examine the road. Officer Elton said that if a moving van had passed that way, its tire marks had been obliterated by other vehicles. It was impossible to tell which route the thieves had traveled. "It'll be strictly guesswork from here," Officer Elton said to Nancy. "Well, in that case," replied Nancy, "it's my guess that the van went to the left." She pointed to a sign which read, "Garwin, 50 miles." "Isn't Garwin a fairly large city?" she queried. "Yes." Perhaps the thieves headed that way to dispose of the stolen furniture. The officer nodded approvingly. "Sounds reasonable," he said. "Well, in any case, we can't go much farther, because we're near the state line." Nancy had another thought. "I'll take the road to Garwin and swing around toward River Heights." She smiled. "If I see those thieves, I'll let you know." "Well, you watch out, young lady. Those men may lock you up again." "Oh, I will. Anyhow, there'll be plenty of traffic as soon as I reach the main highway." Without giving the policeman an opportunity for further objection, Nancy started up and swung her car to the left. She noted in her rearview mirror that the squad car had turned onto the right-hand road. "The officers must have picked up a clue," Nancy said to herself, "but I certainly wish I could spot that van and maybe find a chance to look in the old clock." Nancy soon reached the main road. As mile after mile of highway spun behind her, Nancy's hopes grew dim. There were a number of side roads, any one of which the moving van might have taken to elude pursuers. The young sleuth decided to adhere to her original theory, that Sid and his pals had headed for Garwin, and kept on the main highway. "Those thieves think Jeff and I are still locked up, and won't suspect that they're being followed," she assured herself. Smiling, she thought hopefully, "Well, in that case, they won't be on their guard." About 10 minutes later, Nancy stopped at a service station to have her car refueled, and on impulse asked the attendant, "Did you by any chance see a moving van pass here recently?" "Sure did, miss," was the prompt answer. "About half an hour ago. I noticed it because the driver was going at a terrific speed for a van." Heartened, Nancy thanked him and resumed her pursuit, going past the turn for River Heights. "If only I can overtake the truck, and somehow examine the Crowley clock before I have to report it to the police," she thought. Again, time elapsed, and Nancy still saw no sign of a moving van on the highway. It was growing dusk, and she decided that she would have to admit defeat. "I never caught up to them," she sighed in disappointment, and turning into the opposite lane, headed back for the River Heights road. Just then Nancy recalled that a little beyond the service station where she had stopped, she had noticed a rather run-down old inn. It was a slim hope, she knew, but the thieves might have put the van behind it while having their meal there. "I'll go in and ask anyhow," she decided. Nancy increased her speed as much as she dared, and within a few minutes came in sight of the old inn. It stood back from the road a short distance and was half hidden by tall trees. In front of the building a battered sign bearing the name Black Horse Inn creaked back and forth from a post. There was no sign of the van. Beyond the inn, Nancy glimpsed a garage and a large barn. The doors to both were closed. "I wonder," mused Nancy, "if the moving van is parked inside either one." At the far side of the inn was a small woods with a narrow road leading into it. For safety's sake, Nancy thought it best to park her car on this little used road. She turned off the car lights, pocketed the key, and walked back to the curving driveway leading to the inn. As Nancy made her way forward, her heart pounded. There were tire marks which could belong to Sid's van. They led to the barn. "Maybe those thieves are eating," she thought. "I'll look." As Nancy stepped onto the porch, the sound of raucous laughter reached her ears. She tiptoed to a window and peered inside. What the young sleuth saw made her gasp, but she felt a glow of satisfaction. In a dingy, dimly lit room, 3 men were seated about a table, eating voraciously. They were the thieves who had robbed the Topham bungalow. Now I'm on chapter 15, Nancy's risky undertaking. "I must notify the police at once," Nancy told herself as she recognized the 3 thieves. Turning away from the window, she crept noiselessly from the porch. She was about to make a dash for her car when a sudden thought occurred to her. If the gang have parked the van in the barn, now is my chance to look for the Crowley clock. I'm sure those men will be eating for a while, or they may even be staying overnight. Acting on the impulse, Nancy sprinted to her car. Hastily she snatched a flashlight from the compartment, since it was now dark outside. She made her way cautiously to the rear of the inn. Reaching the barn, she tried the closed doors, her heart pounding. They had not been locked. As she slid back one of the doors, it squeaked in an alarming fashion. Anxiously, Nancy glanced toward the inn, but so far as she could tell, her actions went unobserved. There was no one in sight. Focusing her flashlight, she peered hopefully into the dark interior. A cry of satisfaction escaped her lips. In front of her stood the moving van. "What luck!" she exclaimed, snapping off the light. With a last cautious glance in the direction of the inn, she hastily stepped inside and closed the barn door. With it shut, the interior of the barn was pitch black. Nancy switched on her flashlight again and played it over the moving van. She saw that its rear doors were closed. Securing a firm grip on the handle, she gave it a quick turn. To her dismay, the door did not open. The thieves had locked the van. "Oh, dear, now what shall I do?" she wondered frantically. "I'll never be able to break the lock." Desperately, Nancy glanced about. She dared not remain many minutes in the barn, lest the thieves return and find her there. But she had to find out whether the Crowley clock was in the van. Perhaps the keys were left in the ignition, Nancy thought hopefully. She rushed to the front of the van and clambered into the driver's seat, but there were no keys hanging from the ignition lock. Nancy's mind worked frantically. She must find the keys. Perhaps the man had not taken them into the inn but concealed them in the truck. Suddenly she remembered that people sometimes hid automobile keys under the floor mat. It was barely possible that the thieves had done this. Hastily she pulled up a corner of the mat. Her flashlight revealed a small ring of keys. "Luck was with me this time," she murmured, and quickly snatching up the ring, she ran back to the rear of the van. After trying several of the keys, she at last found one which fitted the lock. Turning it, she jerked open the door. Nancy flashed her light about inside the truck. To her joy, she recognized the van's contents as the furniture stolen from the Tophams' cottage. "What will I do if the clock is on the bottom of the load?" Nancy wondered, as she surveyed the pile of furniture. "Oh, I'll never find it." Dexterously she swung herself up into the truck and flashed the light slowly about on chairs, tables, rugs, and boxes. There was no sign of the Crowley clock. Then the beam rested for a moment on an object in the far corner. With a cry of delight, Nancy saw that her search had been rewarded. Protected by a blanket, an old-fashioned mantel clock rested on top of a table in the very front of the van. The young sleuth scrambled over the pieces of furniture as she tried to reach the clock. Her dress caught on something sharp and tore. Finally she arrived within arm's reach of the blanket. She grasped it and carefully pulled the clock towards her. One glance at the timepiece assured her that it fitted the description Abby Rowan had given her. It had a square face, and the top was ornamented with a crescent. "The Crowley clock at last!" Nancy whispered almost unbelievingly. But as she stood staring at it, her keen ears detected the sound of voices. "The thieves! I'll be caught!" flashed through her mind, "and I won't be able to escape a second time." Clutching the blanket and the clock tightly in her arms, Nancy scrambled over the piled-up furniture as she struggled to get out of the van before it was too late. Reaching the door, she leaped lightly to the floor. She could now hear heavy footsteps coming closer and closer. Nancy shut the truck doors as quickly as possible and searched wildly for the keys. "Oh, what did I do with them?" she thought frantically. She saw that they had fallen to the floor and snatched them up. Hurriedly inserting the correct key in the lock, she secured the doors. But as Nancy wheeled about, she heard men's angry voices directly outside. Already someone was starting to slide back the barn door. "Oh, what shall I do?" Nancy thought in despair. "I'm cornered." She realized instantly that she could not hope to run to the front of the car and place the keys under the mat where she had found them. "I'll just put them here on the floor," she decided quickly. "Maybe the men will think that they've dropped them." Then, glancing frantically about for a hiding place, Nancy saw an empty grain bin. Running to it, still holding the clock, she climbed inside and dropped the blanket over her head just as one of the barn doors slid open. One of the men was speaking loudly. Nancy recognized the voice instantly. It belonged to Sid, the ringleader of the thieves. "You had enough to eat," he growled. "We're going to get out of here before we have the cops down on our heads." He climbed into the cab and turned on the headlights. Nancy held her breath. Would her hiding place be discovered? But the man apparently did not even look toward the bin. In a moment, Sid cried out, "What did you do with those keys? I thought you put 'em under the floor mat." "I did." "Well, they ain't here now." "Honest, boss, Then come and find 'em and don't be all night about it either." All right, get out of the way and give me a chance." As Jake went to the truck and began a careful search for the keys, Nancy listened fearfully from her hiding place. "Say, if you've lost 'em—" The leader did not finish the threat, for at that moment the third man announced, "Here they are on the floor." You must have thought you'd put 'em in your pocket, Jake, and dropped 'em instead." "I didn't," the other retorted. The thieves were obviously in a quarrelsome mood. Just as the leader interposed, "Cut out the yakking. We ain't got no time for a fight unless we want to land behind bars. And if we do, it'll be your fault," said Sachs. "You left that girl to starve." "Shut up," the leader snarled. After a few more angry words, the three thieves climbed into the front seat, and in a moment the engine started. In relief, Nancy heard the men go. The moment they were at a safe distance from the barn, she climbed out of the bin. Nancy watched long enough to make certain that the van had taken the road to Garwin. Then, snatching up her flashlight and clutching the precious clock in her arms, she turned and ran. "I'd better cut through the woods," she decided. As Nancy darted among the trees, she cast an anxious glance over her shoulder, but to her intense relief she saw that she was not being followed. There seemed to be no one in the vicinity of the Black Horse Inn. "I had a narrow escape that time," the young sleuth told herself as she ran. "I hate to think what might have happened if I had been discovered." She clutched the mantel clock more tightly in her arms. "But it was worth the risk I took. I found the clock, and maybe even the secret of Josiah Crowley's will." Reaching the car, Nancy sprang inside. She took the key from her pocket and inserted it into the ignition lock. "I'll notify the police as fast as I can," she decided. "Perhaps the state troopers can catch those men before they dispose of the furniture." Then, just as Nancy was about to start the motor, her glance fell upon the Crowley clock which she had placed on the seat beside her. Did it contain old Josiah's mysterious notebook as she suspected? "Oh, I must find out." She got out her flashlight. Since the clock was too unwieldy to open inside the car, Nancy stepped out and laid it on the ground. She unfastened the glass clock and ran her hand along the walls. There was nothing inside. She tried the back. Only the mechanism of the timepiece was there. "Gone!" Nancy groaned. "Oh dear, has my luck run out?" Could it be, she wondered, that the Tophams had discovered the notebook only to destroy it? Nancy discarded this thought as quickly as it came to mind, for she recalled the conversation she had overheard between Ada and Isabel. No, the Tophams were as ignorant as herself concerning the location of a later will. It was more likely that Abby Rowan had been confused in her story. After all, she had not declared that the notebook would be found inside the clock. Nancy herself had made that deduction. "I was almost certain that I'd find the notebook," she murmured in disappointment, but a moment later she took heart again. "It must be in here somewhere," she told herself. Turning the clock upside down, Nancy gave it a hard shake. Something inside moved. Hopefully, she repeated the action. "Unless I'm wrong," Nancy thought excitedly, "there's something inside this clock beside the works." She examined it more closely. An extra piece of cardboard back of the face, and something in between the two. The notebook, maybe. After a vain attempt to remove the heavy cardboard face with her fingers, Nancy took a small screwdriver from the glove compartment. With the tool, it required but an instant to remove the two hands of the clock and jerk off the face. As the cardboard fell to the floor, Nancy peered inside and gave a low cry of joy. There, at one side of the clock, attached to a hook at the top, dangled a tiny dark blue notebook. And that is the end of chapter 15, which was Nancy's risky undertaking. So the next one is chapter 16, and it's called The Capture. So that will be the next time. I think I'm going to finish the book because I only have this much left to go. So that's only a few more chapters. In total, let's see how many chapters there are. There's 20 chapters. So, a few more to go. Bye. Bye guys. Hope you like that.